Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our session on Inner Work for Social Change. My name is Marissa Naidu, and I am the facilitator for this session. With me, I have Andrea Rodrigues, who's actually from India. She's an independent consultant with NGOs, social enterprises, and movements around multidisciplinary design and collaboration and organizational transitions. A mouthful there, Andrea. Thank you for joining us, and over to you. And if I can just remind our audience that whilst Andrea is commencing with her presentations, please feel free to add your comments into the chat section, any questions for Andrea that you may have in the Q&A session, and if you'd like to raise your hand and be brought onto stage to interact with her at the end, please do so as well. Thank you, Andrea, and the floor is now yours.
All right, thank you, Marissa. And good morning and good afternoon to everyone here. And thank you for inviting me to this stimulating gathering. So I'm joining you from Goa in India, and I'm going to start with a couple of stories. So in 2006, I was living and working in Bangladesh with an international NGO. And one of the issues we were working on was preventing the spread of HIV and AIDS. And our work was with very specific communities of people that public health professionals refer to as high-risk populations. One of these was community of sex workers. And they were a community of people that, while being embedded in society, were excluded in many ways and faced huge amounts of discrimination. And in a very hierarchical society, they were placed very low down and didn't have access to much. But they were active and effective players in preventing the spread of HIV, and many of them demonstrated great, phenomenal leadership. And so we wanted to engage them beyond just, being agents in the fight against HIV, and we began to do some action research about their lives, about the future. And our research team included sex workers as well as our NGO staff. And as we understood their lives better, I was even more impressed at their ability to be effective as they were, because we hadn't realized just the levels of discrimination, how bad they were, and the horrific kind of violence that they faced. And in fact, we had to bring in someone to help process some of the trauma that was being triggered through the research and through these discussions. And as we processed this pain, I observed that several members of these sex worker communities were more open and willing to sort of look at themselves and process the pain. They seemed to have a better developed understanding of their inner world and of practices and routines for what we called inner work, working on themselves, than many of us NGO workers did. And I observed how this ability to look within instilled in them incredible resilience and capacity for love. They seemed, more willing than us to have difficult conversations, to accept when they made mistakes. And despite horrific violence and exclusion they faced in society, they weren't operating from a place of anger. Although they expressed anger, they were able to bring in sort of the depth of their practice and allow themselves to be vulnerable, but still sort of work in quite loving ways. And so it was clear to me that these kinds of qualities that enable them to engage with, it was these kinds of qualities, being able to look within, that enable them to engage with a very diverse spectrum of people in their work, and often people who are more powerful than themselves. And so, I thought that it brought them courage. And we learned a lot from that interaction, which, that wasn't the main focus of our research, but just processing the pain actually taught us a lot. And I was deeply grateful for what we learned together. I'll put that story aside for a little bit and we can come back to it later, but I'll tell you one more story. So a few years ago, I was invited by another organization, Synagogue, that's an international not-for-profit, to write a case study work they had done with others in the state of Maharashtra in India between 2006 and 2011. And they were focused on addressing undernutrition among young children. And at the time the work began, about half the children in the state of Maharashtra children under 5 were stunted. And that's really saying something, because it's actually quite a prosperous state. It's the state in which Mumbai is located. And it does have a lot going for it in terms of development and the economy and all of that. Now, undernutrition, just like HIV, is a complex issue. It spans generations. It affects health. It's affected by the economics of a place, sanitation, social relations, political economy. And in this case, despite enormous investments by the government of India toward nutrition, children in some of the poorest pockets of this fairly prosperous state were starving. And that's what made people think, business as usual wasn't going to work. So they realized that to address undernutrition, it would require to bring in actors from across the system to collaborate and really figure out what was blocking progress. And so Synagos, the organization I mentioned, UNICEF and Unilever came together, and they formed an alliance with players from government, private sector, civil society to work on this issue. It was called the Bhavishya Alliance, which means future. And in those days, there wasn't a lot of partnership across sectors. And there was some skepticism expressed at what they were trying to do. The private sector didn't think that government and NGOs were very efficient, and were at first reluctant to join. NGOs didn't trust the private sector because they did not believe they could be values driven. And the government dismissed the others because they thought they couldn't work at the scale they needed in a place like Maharashtra. And so the conveners of the alliance knew that they couldn't work in traditional ways, and they had to do something that would really shift these perceptions. So they decided to begin in a very different way than they would have normally. They began the work of the alliance with what they called a change lab. And they cultivated in this lab practices of deep listening, reflecting alone and with others, becoming more present to the system and to each other. And participants from NGOs, community organizations, government departments, businesses, they went together on learning journeys together and to communities to understand the issues. And that was very powerful because, they weren't used to talking with each other, and forget going on, long field trips. And people from different parts of the system got to know each other, understand their perspectives, and they became friends. They also they took everyone on a retreat to the Himalayas in the mountains, and it was about a week. And some of that time they were kept alone individually and alone in nature. They reflected on their own barriers to change and, and how they might work in different ways. And being better in touch with their inner selves by allowing themselves to be out there in the wilderness and be vulnerable together, by embracing different perspectives and kinds of knowledge, they began to think of how they could better collaborate across the system in different ways than in the past. And so in the Alliance, they designed interventions and partnerships that at the end of 5 years proved to be very effective. And nutrition levels really improved. And of course, I'm not focusing too much on the statistics because we can't attribute it entirely to the work of the Alliance. But by all accounts, it certainly played an important role because everyone talks. 10 years later, when I was writing the case study, they were all talking about it and as if it was yesterday, and very vivid memories. And I also saw through these interviews how participants continued to draw on many of the inner work, sort of reflective practices that they had cultivated when they were part of this alliance, and were convinced that that had contributed to their effectiveness in making change. And so in their later work, and even though many of them weren't even working in that area anymore, they still used those practices. So that's a couple of stories, and there are more to tell, particularly stories from indigenous communities. But I guess by now you're wondering why I'm bringing up stories that seemingly have nothing to do with oceans or marine life. And And it's this that, I've been thinking about and becoming more curious about this link between inner and outer spaces for people who are engaged in social change. And when you think of the problems we are all working on, like the commitments you're making with the MTA 30 by 30, these are all, nutrition, HIV, they're all complex problems, justice issues. I do a lot of work in the gender justice space. And so we cannot just simply mandate change or say we commit and then expect it to happen. And so in these changing times, also because the world is changing so much, there aren't ready-made solutions. We cannot solve for these complex problems by calling in a team of experts. And so we're realizing more and more that to get to issues like this, it demands creating, bringing together people from across disciplines, bringing together diverse perspectives to make change. It demands the possibility to create generative spaces for change that are not always comfortable spaces. And it demands that we abandon our own insecurities to keep an eye on collective purpose. But that's not always easy. So how do we do it? And I don't have an answer, but I have learned from stories like the two that I told you, that we need more attention to inner work, to our inner selves than we have paid in the past. Because it helps us uncover what may be holding us back individually or as a team. It may be trauma, it may be the fear of working with someone who's different, or it may be previous bad experiences, internal stress. And I have learned that influencing social change requires us to celebrate our connection rather than differences. So it calls us to bring kindness, love to our work and interactions, not words we often mention, and including kindness and love with those who are different. And I don't mean kind of an insipid kind of love or superficial appreciation, but love that allows us to share more of ourselves, to care enough to challenge each other, to build collective power, to learn and change together. And we are at a point on this planet when it's urgent to be able to do so. And your work attests to that. So I'm not saying now that we must all turn inward and practice mindfulness and it will solve things, although mindfulness, of course, is useful. But learning from the kinds of stories I told you, I'm saying that this movement between work on our inner selves, or say on our team, and work out in the outer world is important. So I've started to call it the inner-outer dance for social change. And I like the analogy to dance because I think it's the rhythm, it's a practice, a dance between our inner spaces and relationships and work in the world that brings courage to our work. And I think that, the stories of the sex workers I told you in Bangladesh.
Apologies, Andrea. Andrea, I'm so sorry. I just have to remind you of time and for us to allow some questions a little bit towards the end. Yeah. Thank you. You can go ahead and finish and tie up. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just wind up. So these stories, I think that these stories of unlikely partners in Maharashtra or sex workers in Bangladesh are examples of that kind of dance. And so I just wanted to put up some questions to consider and not to answer. I'm just sort of posing questions, something that you can take away. And that's how might we cultivate a more regular inquiry and care of self, beginning to understand our own barriers and interpretations of the world that come in the way of our engaging meaningfully with others for positive change. How might we listen better, build connection with each other, including with those different to ourselves, to build collaboration that shifts power and overcomes persistent barriers to change? And how might we cultivate generative spaces that help create greater collective power and love, that celebrate different forms of knowledge and knowing and enable us to act together? And there are many things. If we look around, there are small things we can do. We can discuss them if you like. The people I encountered on my journey helped me see the fractal nature of our world and of social change. And you may have heard of the golden ratio that appears in nature, music, history, architecture at many scales. And there's a growing understanding that the patterns of the universe repeat at scale. So how we are at small scale is how we are at large scale. how we are within influences our relationships and reverberates in the world. And so I think I'll end there. I hope I've interested you enough to think about or explore the Inner Outer Dance for Social Change, and that it helps you in your commitment to the 30 by 30 agenda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you so much for sharing those, those really personal stories with us. I think it helps us, move forward in terms of social change and to understand that there's people, real people with real emotions behind the work that we are doing. And I don't see any questions in the Q&A at the moment. But if anyone has anything that they'd like, even to share a story of your own, or maybe you've worked in a space where, similar to Andrea, where you've worked with people or worked with communities, you're welcome to do so in the chat or comment on anything that she said. I do see a hand raised, Andrea, and I'd like to bring Simone onto stage to engage with you further. Michelle, if you could bring Simone for us, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Simone.
Hey, Marissa, can you hear me?
Yes, well, we can hear you.
Hi, Andrea. Lovely to see you. And thanks for your presentation. I hope everyone managed to get a screenshot of those questions, because I just think they're such important questions for us to be asking. I just wanted to reflect on my experience with this. I'm particularly passionate about this work, this idea of inner work for social change. And I've always been interested I studied psychology, and I've always been interested in how people think and our behavior. And I've used my own life as a case study for this. And this is especially important for those of us working in social and environmental situation, where we are trying to impact change, particularly in an urgent scenario like we are now. And so, the way that we are in the world and what we bring to the work that we do and to the relationships ultimately affects the results of our work. And now more than ever, that focusing on relationship and being able to hold positive relationship is so important. Anyway, so I don't want to take the stage too long, but I just wanted to say thank you so much. And yeah, thank you for bringing the concept of kindness and love into work, because that's, when we can bring those kind of energies into our relationships is when we really have positive impact. So yeah, I really just want to say thank you for that, and thank you for bringing this conversation. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Simone.
Thank you so much, Simone. Andrea, I have a question. From your experiences, what advice would you give us all when working, in this context? If I could just sort of put it more, give you a little bit more context. When, for example, marine protected areas were declared in the past, they were done so in a manner that, that affected communities and their livelihoods, and it wasn't done in a very just manner. So, similar to the story you shared with us on about the sex workers, and, what sort of approach do you take, with people that have been wounded by their past or by, history, in order to now sort of, gain their trust and to also move forward towards solutions that ultimately will benefit them and, benefit their communities for that matter?
Yeah, great question and difficult question, because of course, we can't have a standard approach to injustice that people feel, and you used the word, Marissa, wounded, and I think that, the only thing to do is, well, find a place to start. And a place to start would be understanding what that wound looks like, understanding the histories, deep listening, and if it's possible to bring the different stakeholders, actors together, that's a good place. That's a good way to have the conversation. But sometimes the hurts are too strong and you can't do that at first. In which case, I think, there may need to be safe spaces just to unpack and see, whether people are willing to open, are willing to engage with someone else. But sometimes when trust is broken, I don't know if it's always repairable. I like to think that, over time you can do that, but it takes very deep and committed work. And that's why I think the more we can bring in sort of our inner selves into the work, then often when you see something change is when some powerful person actually becomes vulnerable in the space in discussion and really realizes what's going on. But it takes some work to break that down, because we often interact so much in roles and hierarchies and positions. So finding ways to break that down, think about themselves, their childhoods. Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Andrea. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for in this session. And I could honestly, personally listen to you speak and speak and speak, because you have just such a captivating voice, and the conversation that, we're really talking about, as I said, real people and real emotions behind these stories. So thank you so much for sharing with us and for engaging with us. And for our members of the audience as well, Andrea isn't going anywhere, I hope. And if you would like to possibly engage with her a little bit more, the social lounge is also available to perhaps network with her and maybe even ask these questions or answer these questions with her that she's asked us. Thank you so much, Andrea, for your time, and we really appreciate it. All the best.
Thank you, Marissa, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks, ladies. Bye.
Bye.